Honorable Robert P. Casey, U.S. Senator from the great state of Pennsylvania and hometown Scranton, Pennsylvania. Senator Casey has joined us many times over our 20 years, and we thank him very much for his continued support of our conference. He is one of our primary champions for disability concerns on Capitol Hill, and we are so grateful for him taking time to send us these remarks. I cannot speak more highly of his support. Here is Senator Robert P. Casey.
Hello, I'm Senator Bob Casey. I'm honored to welcome you to the 20th Annual Conference on Disability, organized by the great University of Scranton. I want to thank the university and the Penobscot College of Professional Studies for continuing to host this important conference. I also want to commend and thank Ed and Patricia Leahy. So many reasons to thank them for their great advocacy for people with disabilities and for their support of this conference from its very inception. So I want to thank them for all the good work they've done. As many of you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act turned 31 years old this year. It's a landmark piece of legislation, of course, affirming the rights of people and establishing goals for full inclusion in all aspects of American society. And you know those goals: equal opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. We've made excellent progress on so many of these, or at least parts of these goals, but we got a ways to go. We haven't fully achieved the goals of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So as we do that work on the ADA, we also have to recognize some realities that face so many Americans today who have disabilities. We have too many people with disabilities, for example, who are living in poverty. Over a quarter of adults with disabilities live below the federal poverty level. And people with disabilities are unemployed or underemployed at far greater rates than people who don't have a disability. In addition to being unemployed at higher rates, the very financial system of the United States of America is not set up to allow people with disabilities to save for emergencies or to buy a home and provide for themselves. We continue to see an increase in climate-related disasters as well, and have seen that people with disabilities are too often left out of the planning and response process at alarming levels at every level of government, the federal, state, and local level. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected people with disabilities at much greater rates than the general population. The need for safe, high-quality, home and community-based services is also part of our challenge looking down the road. We've got to make some progress on that issue as well. As I said, we have achieved a lot, and you all have been a huge part of that. But to fully achieve the goals set out by the ADA, we've got to do several things. Maybe just mention three broad areas. One, we need to promote employment of people with disabilities through tax incentives. Tax incentives like the ones that I proposed in my Disability Employment Incentive Act, which would ensure workplaces are accessible for people with disabilities. Second, we need to reduce the barriers to economic stability that are clearly evident right now by ensuring that people with disabilities can earn and save for the future. Here's two bills to do that. I've got the Able Age Adjustment Act, which would make it possible for 6 million more Americans, including 1 million veterans with disabilities, to open an account and save for the future by raising the age level from 26 to 46, before which you'd have to have acquired your disability. So adjusting the ABLE Act, that's what we call it, the Able Age Adjustment Act. We've got to get that passed. It's got bipartisan support, significant, not just one or two, but robust bipartisan support. The second bill, under this broad heading of earning and saving, is the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, which will help create economic self-sufficiency by increasing opportunities for competitive, integrated employment for people with disabilities. And then number three, perhaps the most critical issue we face is the availability, or I should say the lack of availability, of home and community-based services. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen how important it is for people with disabilities to have the option to receive their supports in their homes. To promote high-quality home and community-based services throughout the country, I've introduced the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, which will strengthen and expand home and community-based services and support the caregiving workforce. We've got to do all of that. Increase services for seniors, for people with disabilities, but we have to lift up this workforce that does such essential, even heroic work. You can't pay people $12 an hour and say that we have the best caregiving in the world. We don't. We should, though, by paying people more and by increasing services. So it is about better care. It's also about better jobs. In order to reach all of the goals of the ADA, we must make sure that people with disabilities have both the resources and the accommodations that they need. By passing the Better Care, Better Jobs bill, that is one way we can make sure that those resources are available. So I promise to continue the fight for those resources and, of course, to protect the rights of people with disabilities. So I could keep you longer, but I won't. But I do want to thank you for the tireless advocacy that each of you engage in on behalf of people with disabilities. And to thank you once again for inviting me to join you by way of this video to this important conference. Good luck with the conference, and God bless your work.
Senator Casey, you truly set the world on fire with your passion. We need you. The ABLE Act, everything that you mentioned, go for it, make a difference. We're counting on you. Now, it's time for me to introduce our Acting Assistant Secretary, Katherine Neas. Secretary Neas serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the U.S. Department of Education. In this capacity, she serves as advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Education on matters related to the education of children and youth with disabilities, as well as employment and community living for youth and adults with disabilities. The mission of her office is to improve early childhood educational and employment outcomes and to raise expectations for all people with disabilities, their families, their communities, and the nation. And I know our own Patricia Leahy is one of her biggest supporters. Welcome. Here she is, Secretary Katie Neas. I love the name Katie, K-A-T-Y.
Hello, I'm Katie Neas, Acting Assistant Secretary at the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the U.S. Department of Education. I want to first and foremost thank the University of Scranton for inviting me to provide remarks at its 20th Annual U.S. Conference on Disability. It's an honor to be here. I also want to give a shout out to your partners at the Autism Collaborative Centers for Excellence and the All One Foundation for their leadership in supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorders and their families across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services mission is to improve early childhood, educational, and employment outcomes and raise expectations for all people with disabilities, their families, their communities, and the nation. We envision that all individuals with disabilities, including those with autism, will live and thrive in their communities. There are two separate entities within OSERS. They are the Office of Special Education Programs and the Rehabilitative Services Administration. OSEP is responsible for overseeing the administration of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the law that supports more than 7 million children through the early intervention system for infants and toddlers and special education and related services for preschool and school-age children. RSA provides grants for state vocational rehabilitation and supported employment programs that help nearly 2 million individuals with disabilities each year. I don't need to tell you that it's been an unprecedented 20 months. While some students have thrived in a virtual education, others have struggled greatly, and some stopped attending classes altogether. While I'm optimistic that the pandemic will wane, I also share Secretary Cardona's profound commitment to having all students, including those with autism, return to safe in-person learning. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it so that systems, schools, and providers had to rethink how to provide a free, appropriate public education consistent with the need to protect the health and safety of children and students with disabilities and those serving them. With that in mind, OSERS recently released guidance that reaffirmed that the pandemic didn't alter IDEA's guarantee of a free, appropriate public education for children with disabilities. This guidance is part of our return to school roadmap and focuses on two key elements: the proper identification of eligible children and the proper implementation of their individualized education program. Soon, we will publish a comprehensive review of mental health services resources, and later this fall, we will publish guidance on the proper identification of infants and toddlers with disabilities and the implementation of their individualized family services plan. We all know that the choices we have as adults are greatly enhanced by the educational opportunities we had as children. That's why we're so committed to ensuring that this school year is better than last year's, and that youth with disabilities have access to pre-employment transition services that will help them explore careers that are aligned with their interests and strengths. As part of our oversight of the vocational rehabilitation program, we are supporting states in their delivery of high quality and effective employment services so that adults with disabilities can find good jobs with good wages so they can live in the community. To this end, we are partnering with the Department of Labor and the Department of Health and Human Services on initiatives to expand employment opportunities for people with significant disabilities, including those on the autism spectrum. I hope today's conference is a grand success. Thank you for all you do, and I look forward to working with you in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you, Katie. That was wonderful. We really appreciate your words. Our next presenter is alive. We will have time for Q&A, so please make sure to write your questions in the chat bar. Dr. Gamel-McCormick is currently the Disability Policy Director for Senator Casey. He brings extensive experience from his early years as a teacher in inclusive settings to his work now in disability policy development. We are delighted that he is here to join us today. There will be time for some questions again, so please, you're welcome to submit them through the chat, and my wonderful co-chairs, Dr. Lori Brook and Dr. Rebecca Doggin, will be writing them down. So with further ado, I give you Dr. Michael Gamel-McCormick. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Dean Pellegrino. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me just reiterate what Senator Casey said in his video remarks. The work that is done at the University of Scranton and through your college, and the decades of this particular conference really advance disability programming, but maybe more importantly, disability awareness and rights. And thank you for that extraordinary effort that has been the dedication of the university, and of course your partners, Patricia and her husband Ed, in supporting this conference. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone here today. I'm gonna get a little bit policy-wise and a little bit wonky and a little bit weedy. I hope it's not overly so, and I will very much look forward to hearing questions and comments from you all, and we'll make sure that we have some time to do that. But my plan is to actually go over some major pieces of legislation, either things that are very far along in the process, or pieces that we expect will hopefully pass in the next couple of months, and in some cases in the next couple of years. I'm going to start off with the biggest piece of effort that it's taking place in the US Congress right now, and Senator Casey already mentioned this in his comments, and that's the effort to enhance, expand, and improve home and community-based services for people with disabilities. Home and community-based services, or HCBS as we sometimes call it for short, are a set of services that happen through the Medicaid program. They are not required by law. They are a set of services that are tailored to individual states, and in most cases within those states, they are tailored to individual groups of people with disabilities. Pennsylvania has a number of waivers, but if you go to Iowa or Montana or to Florida, you'll find other types of home and community-based services. The key of those services is that it allows for providing services and supports to people with disabilities in their homes as they need them, and also in their community settings too, so that they can possibly go to work, they can possibly go to school, they can certainly interact with their neighbors and community members, and shopping and all of the things that all of us do on a daily basis. The thing that we know right now, though, however, is that there are hundreds of thousands of people on the waiting list in the country for home and community-based services. The official number hovers somewhere around 820,000 people. But one of the things that we know by talking to state directors of Medicaid services and to advocates and to many people in each of those states is that that number is very likely a significantly low number. It underestimates what is actually necessary out there. So in March, President Biden made a proposal in his American Jobs Plan, actually, and said, look, we need to increase home and community-based services. Senator Casey took up the mantle of that challenge and created a piece of legislation that is called the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, which would invest a historic amount of funding into home and community-based services with a number of very, very clear goals in place. And those goals are, one, is to expand home and community-based services within the states across the country with the goal of eliminating waiting lists, and also setting a floor of certain types of services. And that floor would be making sure that personal care services are available across the nation, making sure that that family support services are available, including things like respite care and training and access to assistive technology, making sure the second big goal, in addition to expanding services and making sure they're available, is making sure that the workforce is available to deliver those services in homes and communities. And that means increasing the funds that states would have to be able to pay for the workforce. One of the things that we know right now is that the home and community-based services workforce is not large enough to actually provide the services needed. The vacancy rates across the country are running somewhere between 20 and 40%. In some cases, they're running as high as 50 or 60%. The turnover rates are extraordinarily high on an annual basis, running between 40 and 60% as well. And that means the people who need these services, whether they're older adults or they're people with disabilities, they don't have a continuity of care. They have a turnover in those providers. And that means that those individuals really need to have a system that will support them and continue to support them on a predictable basis. So the investment in home and community-based services, as you heard Senator Casey talk about, is for him the highest priority right now. And we're trying to move that effort through a process that is called reconciliation. And if you have questions about that in terms of the process, I'm glad to answer them later. I don't want to get into the extraordinarily weedy specifics of that. But the bottom line is that from the senator's point of view and from many, many other folks' point of views, that we need to make this investment in services that will support people with disabilities, primarily where they want to be living. And that overwhelmingly what we hear is that individuals want to be living either in their own homes or with their families or with friends in community settings where we can actually support them and make sure that they have all of the things that living in the community can actually offer to people. That's by and large what is taking up a large amount of our time right now in Congress, and particularly in my boss's office. There are certainly lots of other things too, and you heard Senator Casey mention quite a number of other priorities that he has in terms of looking at disability policy. And before I get into those specifics, let me just make a comment in general about where we are particularly in the Senate, but also across all of Congress regarding disability policy. I've been doing the work in Congress for about 12 years now. I had a whole nother lifetime, and Dean Pellegrino mentioned that I used to be a teacher. I also used to be a university professor. And about 12 years ago, I made a transition to Congress. I worked for Tom Harkin at the time. Tom Harkin was the Senate author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And 12 years ago, we didn't have a lot of advocates in the US Senate around disability policy. It was much more a niche or a specific area that Senator Harkin, and until they retired, Senator Dodd from Connecticut, and unfortunately when Senator Kennedy died, he was one of the great proponents of disability policy as well. But it was much more coalesced back then. I'm happy to report that in 2021, we have 10 or 12 or 15 great Senate advocates for disability policy. We have sent people like Senator Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, who not only understands this from a governor's point of view, where she was governor in New Hampshire, but she also understands it from a family point of view because she has a son who has very complex cerebral palsy. We have people like Tammy Duckworth, Senator Duckworth from Illinois, who, as many of you know, suffered significant injuries when she was in service in Iraq. And she can talk firsthand and often does about how important disability policy is. We have Senator Kaine and Senator Van Hollen and Senator Booker, and I can go down the list and say, what's happened with disability policy in the last decade or so is that it has risen to a level that people are aware that it touches virtually every single family in the United States. So it has gone from being a very specific set of policies to one that really speaks to every American family, every family and individual across the nation, in every corner of every state. And it's heartening to really see that we have a coalition of people who consider disability policy to be essential, basic, core policy for America. That said, we still struggle, and you heard the senator talk about the struggles of trying to get some of the policy to move forward. One of those areas that he is spending an enormous amount of time in is around employment. Disability employment is at half the level that it is for the general population. And I say that in the shadow of actually really good news that has happened just this past Friday. On Friday, we got the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers for employment for the country out of the Department of Labor. And what the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported on Friday was that disability employment, participation in the workforce, is at the highest level that it has been since we have started to keep records for it. That record keeping admittedly did not start to take place until 2008. But in those 13 years, it's at the highest level. That's coming out of a pandemic where we saw enormous drops in employment. But that rate still is half the rate of the general population. So we have a long way to go to help people with disabilities be prepared for employment, be hired, and be able to be retained for employment. And so that's an extraordinarily important goal that the senator is working on. He mentioned during his comments one of the mechanisms that he would like to use to do that, and that's to increase the tax credits for hiring a person with a disability. And sometimes the senator and I get pushback about tax credits for hiring people with disabilities, and they say, well, we shouldn't have to provide tax credits for that hiring. And I always say, in the best world, that's absolutely true. We shouldn't have to, because the skill level that people with disabilities have, the creativity, the personal experiences that often help with great problem solving are just endemic. They are part of who people with disabilities often are. But the reason we provide tax credits is because there is a bias barrier. There is prejudice. There is an attitude sometimes with some employers that a person with a disability can't do work or they can't do sufficient work. So the Disability Employment Incentive Act actually provides a $5,000 tax credit for 1 year for hiring somebody with a disability. And then for a second year, if that person's retained, there's a $2,500 tax credit. And from that point on, there is not a tax credit. The person becomes, hopefully, a valued employee of that workforce. But it's a way to break down those barriers, those attitudinal barriers, those biases that are out there, and those prejudices that are out there. The other piece that Senator Casey talked about was the transformation to competitive employment. One of the things we know is that not only the participation in the workforce is low, but what people with disabilities are paid is significantly lower. For those who have full-time jobs, and we compare them with individuals who have the same education level and the same experience, they make 2/3 of what the general population makes. And then when we throw in the ability to pay many people with disabilities sub-minimum wage, it brings down those pay rates even further. So the senator mentioned the transformation to competitive employment that would help employers who pay sub-minimum wage shift their business models to continue to support those individuals, to help them get wraparound services, but to help those businesses shift from a sub-minimum wage model to a competitive integrated model of employment. And we've seen this happen in many, many places around the country. There are about 49,000 people right now who are paid sub-minimum wage, and we want to help those employers make that transition. The other thing that I'll just say about employment overall is that over the last 18 to 20 months during the pandemic, one of the things that we've seen is that while there was clearly a dip in disability employment during the pandemic, the recovery was faster than even for the general population. And also explains a little bit why we saw this past Friday the highest level of employment. And that's because people with disabilities are often doing what we've learned is essential jobs right now. They work in warehouses. They fulfill e-commerce requests. They work in grocery stores. They work in hospitals. They work in many, many of the places that have to keep functioning and had to keep functioning during the pandemic. And as other places open up, as we hopefully, as Katie said, come out of this pandemic, they also work in restaurants and other publicly facing businesses as well. People with disabilities provide an essential set of services. And they did it in many cases throughout the pandemic, and they're continuing to do it as we come out of the pandemic. And we need to really recognize the fact that they are an essential part of our overall workforce. And that means making sure that the pathway to employment is actually as smooth as possible and as supportive as possible. Let me go into a couple of other areas that are part of what is happening in Congress right now. You heard Acting Assistant Secretary Katie Neas talk about early intervention, infant and toddler services, what sometimes is called Part C of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're seeing that there is an opportunity to invest in that system right now. And also the comparable preschool disability services, the 3 to 5-year-old services as well. Those services have never been fully funded to the level that they need to be. Right now, during the reconciliation discussions that are taking place in Congress, we're seeing that there are opportunities to invest much more money so that states and local school districts can actually provide those infant toddlers and those preschool services. Likewise with IDA services, the special education services and the related services for them as well. You know, in many cases, many of you know, that in 1975, what Congress promised was that the United States government would provide 40% of the difference between educating a general education student and a student who needed special education and related services. That number has never been met. It has never been met. We got close to it in 2009 and 2000, or I'm sorry, we got closer to it in 2009 and 2010 when we saw it reach around 22, 23%. But in recent years, it's fallen back down into the mid-teens or 16, 17%. The senator has been working very hard with Senator Van Hollen and a number of other people to really raise that number up significantly. So we really can get to school districts what the dollars are they need, not only to provide these services, but to also make sure that those services are of as possibly high quality as needed by students. And to really create systems that will prepare them for moving into higher education in many cases, or moving into the workforce as they leave. And all that work we know starts to take place at the early intervention level and then throughout their pre-K-12 experiences. There are a couple of other policy areas that Congress has been working on as well in the past 18 months or so that have really hit home. And one of those areas is voting rights and access to voting. Senator Casey, after the 2020 election, commissioned a study to look at how accessible voting was for people with disabilities. He actually did that also in 2016. And in 2016, one of the things we found was that less than 25% of polling places, whether it was early polling or day of elections, were inaccessible to people with disabilities. They may have had parking lots that were made of gravel and stone, and you couldn't get over them. The accessible voting machines may not have been set up. There may not have been somebody to make it possible to actually get into buildings. Only 25% of settings were accessible in 2016. What we looked at in 2020 was our early voting and mail voting systems accessible to people with disabilities. And we found that there are barriers there too. So what Senator Casey has done with a number of his colleagues, including Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, is to introduce the Accessible Voting Act that would do two things. One is to make sure that states have the resources to monitor and oversee that local election places are accessible. And that includes, importantly, the fact that voter information that is online is accessible to people as well. Folks can often say that I can find out where my local voting place is or what I need to do to register or when I can go vote because I can hop online and look at the county vote election, the website, or the state election website. What we found is that many of those websites were not accessible. So we really need to make sure that not only the physical places and the physical way that people vote, but also the information that they have available to them is accessible. We need to make sure that screen readers for people who are blind are active and possible. And we need to make sure that the instructions are in plain language and available in plain language. So if I have an intellectual or developmental disability, I can understand exactly how I can vote as well. It's good to hear that we have, as I said, partners in the Senate who really value that. And there are a couple of pieces of legislation that are moving forward that have embedded those accessible voting principles in them. And we're hoping that we can see many of them passed in the next few months or so. I'll go on to just a couple of other places. I told you I was going to get real weedy and real specific in terms of policy, but let me cover just a couple of more topics as we talk about what is actively happening in Congress right now. An extraordinarily important area, and Senator Casey alluded to this in his comments, is financial health and security for people with disabilities. There is no subgroup that has a higher poverty rate than people with disabilities. He mentioned a quarter of people with disabilities, and I'll clarify that even a little bit further. 26% of adults 16 to 64 years of age who have a disability do not earn above the federal poverty level. It means 26% of adults with disabilities live in poverty. It's more than twice what the general poverty rate is for our country overall. It's a shameful number, and we need to do something to actually improve that and to help people with disabilities raise themselves out of poverty. I've already talked about the employment piece, and that encouraging employment and making sure that we have access to employment will help do that. There are a couple of other things that will help as well. And Senator Casey mentioned the ABLE Act and the fact that the ABLE Act currently is only available to those under the age of 26 who have acquired their disability by that 26th birthday. He has in place the Able Age Adjustment Act, which would extend that to 46 years of age. And he mentioned that would increase the likelihood of opening an ABLE account for 6 million more people, including 1 million of whom are veterans and have acquired their disability sometime after 26 years of age. What that means is that group of individuals will be able to save for education or an accessible vehicle, to open a small business, and not threaten the loss of their federal benefits, which means sometimes their supplemental security income, often means their health care. It gives them the flexibility and the opportunity to save and actually improve components of their life. And so we really need to make sure that that opportunity is out there as well. There are also numerous barriers in the Social Security programs as well. One of those is the fact that there is an asset limit of what people with disabilities can own and still continue to receive those benefits. ABLE addresses that in some cases. There's also a cap on what can be earned each month. And that cap right now is about $1,300 a month. That cap means that many people can accept a raise in their jobs, in their current jobs, or it means that they can't move to another job someplace else and actually earn more. It also means in some cases that if they're offered a job out of state, they may not be able to change jobs and go out of state because they may actually lose their Medicaid availability as well, which often provides those home and community-based services so they can actually get to work. And in many cases also makes it possible for them to frankly, to live on a daily basis. I have a wonderful a constituent in Erie who says, look, I don't want to just survive, I want to thrive. And we need to move our policies, particularly our financial policies, to a point where it lets people with disabilities thrive in their lives, to really achieve, to take advantage of those opportunities that are available. Two last things I want to point out, and then we can move to some questions and some comments. The senator has spent a lot of time, and we have seen a lot of effort in the Senate around looking at the interactions between law enforcement and people with disabilities. It's a sad and a horrible situation, but when we look at the violent interactions between law enforcement and people with disabilities, we see an enormously high injury and death rate that is happening. And so what the senator has proposed is a set of legislation, two pieces, that one would help law enforcement across the country learn how to interact with people with disabilities, to know what it's like to interact with somebody who is deaf and who may not be able to respond to directions or commands, to know what it is like to interact with somebody who may have autism, to know what it's like and how to actually speak to somebody who has Down syndrome and may have an accompanying intellectual disability, and know that you have to use more plain language when you interact with them. Almost every day I get a news story that's sent to me about horrific interactions that have occurred. And it is, I think that we can actually help this and change this. We should not be putting people with disabilities in a situation where they're fearful of interactions with law enforcement. The other thing that Senator Casey has done is he's introduced a piece of legislation that would provide an alternative to responses of law enforcement to non-criminal emergency situations, so that if there's somebody who's having a mental health crisis or an anxiety crisis, that you would call a different number, or in some cases you would call 911 and be referred to a 211 effort that would send out a social worker or a mental health worker or some support worker who can actually address the needs of those individuals and those families in many cases. So that what we're seeing, we're getting the people who can provide services directly to those individuals. Law enforcement personnel tell us that that would be extraordinarily useful, that even if they have training, it's far better to have somebody who has a mental health background and can interact with somebody who may be in crisis, and to avert what may end up being a violent or in some cases just a horrific interaction that ends up occurring. So those pieces of information legislation are hopefully moving forward. We unfortunately saw the efforts to do a bipartisan justice and policing bill fall apart just last month, which was very sad. But we think that a number of people, other members in the Senate, are going to help take up these efforts and move them forward. And then the last thing I just want to talk about, and then we can move to some questions, is around access to higher education. When I was a teacher, one of the things that astounded me is that the level of expectations for academic achievement for preschoolers and elementary school and high school students with disabilities was often very, very low. I spent many years doing some consultations in counties in Virginia, especially some rural counties in Virginia. And I would go to some classrooms, high school classrooms, where many youth and teens with disabilities were being educated. And I'd sometimes find school books that were from the 1940s, that those students didn't have access to the general curriculum that was being taught in the rest of the schools. And I took a real interest in looking at students with Down syndrome and their availability to actually be instructed reading and math. And during my 15 years as a teacher, one of the things that I saw change over time is that we saw that students who had Down syndrome were often, even when they had aged out of their IDEA services, they were reading sometimes at a first grade level or in the second grade level or so. By the time I was finished teaching, 15 years later, we were seeing students with Down syndrome who were often reading at a 7th or an 8th grade level. There's nothing about Down syndrome that changed there. What changed was the fact that we realized we have to get instruction to students, and we have to have expectations that are high, and we have to provide the supports and services that are necessary to be in place. But that's actually the critical component. IEP means individualized, and we need to pay attention to the individual needs and supports that students have. And I'm glad that our education system has moved to some extent there. As I said earlier, and as Senator Casey always says, we need to make sure more of those supports are in place. But this is also true at higher education. We've often concluded that young people with disabilities, we don't even think about them moving to higher education in some cases. And we've proven since 2008 with a set of programs that that's not the case. We've seen hundreds of transition programs from pre-K-12 to higher education, whether it's community college or four-year colleges or certificate programs, industry and professional certificate programs, where many youth with disabilities have thrived. And we need to make sure that that access is available. So Senator Casey has a couple of pieces of legislation that address the needs of those who have mental health disabilities, those who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, those who have learning disabilities, to make sure that they can have access to higher education when they want it, and to make sure that they have the supports that they need as well. You heard him talk about the goals of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and to make sure that there's full participation, there's full citizenship, there's inclusion, there's economic self-sufficiency. Without those things, without good education, without good support, without making sure that we have barriers swept aside and opportunities to move forward, we're not going to meet those goals. And I know that he is extraordinarily thankful for the fact that there is a large set of partners in the Senate, and then people like you, who are advocating to make sure that those opportunities and services are there, and to help to sweep away the barriers that are in place as well. I'll stop there. It's a lot of weedy stuff that I talked about. I am happy to talk about more specifically some comments or questions that you might have, but thank you for this opportunity. And I know the Senator is so appreciative about this particular conference and the efforts that you all put on every year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And we do have a few questions for you. I'm so glad that you addressed one of the questions happened to be for raising the ABLE Act from ages 26 to 46, and especially you addressed that and how important it is for our veterans and the 6 million people out there. Here's one question, and I know our CFO, Ed Steinmetz, would be very grateful to hear this one, as are provosts and colleges and universities across the United States. Do you know if there are specific grants or scholarships for young adults with ASD to go to college? And I even think the All One Foundation would like to know, because this is one thing we're hearing from so many of our populations. Anything that you could address on that?
There's a program that was passed in 2008 out of the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, that created what's called TIPSID programs. These are transition programs to post-secondary education. Those grants are out there. They get competed every 5 years. I apologize, Dean, I can't remember when the last competition was. Pennsylvania actually has a network of these grants. Millersville University has one of the grants, and I want to say, don't hold me to this, but I think St. Joe's does in Philadelphia, also has one of those grants. So reaching out to Millersville or St. Joe's would be, and they don't only do it for those universities. Millersville in particular does some work that is across the state. But that's the big national grant that I know of.
Add that to our ACE newsletter that goes out weekly. The next question, if you could just, that was in the chat, the federal government hires people with disabilities. But if a person with a disability is hired, the person has 2 years of probation. For the general population, it is only 1 year. How could you address that for us?
I actually can't, because I don't know that. I don't know where that policy comes from or what it is. So I apologize. If the individual wants to provide more information, I can certainly look into that.
Okay. And now the next question. Would you please provide some practical strategies for families and people with disabilities on communicating with their senators and Congress? And I know Senator Casey's very easy, but if you could just address it for all of our states.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's probably in many ways the most important question when we talk about policy. And I always recommend 3 things. One is that if you can coalesce your personal story into 2 or 3 paragraphs in a photograph, it has more power than anything. It absolutely does. And if that story can, end with a pretty clear need, for instance, there needs to be grants for transitioning to post-secondary education, or we need more access to, private duty nurses, or we need to make sure that there's more access to occupational therapists in Elk or Jefferson or Venango County, because there aren't a lot of rural therapy services. Make sure that your story is really clear and it has a specific need or ask at the end of it. Senator Casey says this all the time. He says, I can go to my colleague, I can go to Senator Van Hollen or Senator Booker, or whomever, and I can ask them to do something, but that he has far less power than you do. And it's really true. It absolutely is true. Your power to your US senator or your US congressman or woman is just far greater, and your story makes a huge difference. Now, there's two additional things there. If you can bring some data about other people with you, that helps too. So you get a good pounding story, and then you get a set of data that says, and it's not just me or my son or my daughter or my husband, but it's also these 10,000 other people or these million other people or whatever that need this same type of support as well. So you start with a good story, you add some data in, and those two things are really powerful. The third thing is longer term, and it's relationship building. I've been with Senator Casey for 5 years. I used to work for Senator Harkin before that from Iowa. In both cases, I get people who come and talk to me or visit me when we could visit face to face in the before times on a regular basis. And I don't mean on an annual basis. I actually mean like every 3 or 4 months, I'll touch base. So I'll get a phone call from somebody, from Dauphin County who provides early intervention services, say. And she'll keep me up to date on what's happening and what is needed and what she's seeing at her level. And she'll do it like 3 or 4 times a year. And what that does is it provides me as a staff member, and it provides Senator Casey as a senator with somebody who we have relationships with and who are trusted. And if we're starting to talk about Part C services and the need for improving the early intervention system, I'm going to go to her. I have a relationship with her, and she's given me information, and I trust her. And that's really, really powerful for everybody. You have a relationship with a staff member, and I have a relationship with somebody who can really tell me what's happening on the ground. And that's just key. My rule is the rule of 3, touch base 3 times a year and provide some update or some information. And that means when there's tough decisions to make and when you're making a tough ask, you've got a relationship there that you can build on to make that tough ask. I hope that makes sense.
Totally does. So our session is ending. We have to move on to our next, but I wanted to thank you more than 3 times. You were fantastic. Please know that we appreciate all the work of Secretary Katie Neas, Senator Casey, and above all for you getting into the weeds for us. And we will touch base 3 times with our senator and congressman. We will become advocates. So thank you, and take care. And we will put information out for everyone on the questions that we needed to dig deeper to. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.